Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever stopped to think about how ancient cultures tried to make sense of the world
Hmm.
and even our own bodies?
Without, microscopes or modern science?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just using a few fundamental elements. It's this idea that pops up in different places like ancient Greece, ancient China.
It is absolutely fascinating, isn't it, how different cultures landed on this idea of sort of foundational building blocks,
Hmm.
but then took them in such different directions.
Right, and that divergence, that's really what we're diving into today.
Hmm.
We've been looking at material that explores two major ancient element theories. You've got the classic four elements from ancient Greece: earth, water, air, fire. Familiar stuff.
Yeah.
And then the five elements from traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM. That's wood, fire, earth, metal, and water.
Slightly different list there. And the core question this material really digs into is, well, how did that five elements theory in China become this really complex, systematic medical framework, one that's still used today in TCM?
Well, the four elements in the West, which heavily influenced uh, the humoral theory,
A big one in Western history.
huge. But it didn't really evolve into modern medicine, did it? It kind of hit a dead end, scientifically speaking.
Exactly. So, what did the differences, cultural, historical, maybe even political, tell us about why one became a lasting medical system and the other was, well, eventually replaced?
That's our mission for this deep dive. We want to pull out the insights from the material to understand these really distinct paths and what they show us about how people thought about health.
Okay, so where should we start? Maybe ground ourselves in that Western concept first. The four elements.
Good idea. So the four elements theory: earth, water, air, fire.
Yeah, this was a really foundational idea in ancient Greek philosophy. The basic premise was that everything in the universe wasn't, infinitely complicated.
Right.
It was made up of just these four fundamental things, sometimes called roots.
I think it was Empedocles, back in the 5th century BCE, who really formalized it. This idea that everything was just these four things mixed together in different ways.
That's the one. And they weren't just physical substances, were they? Each element had qualities associated with it.
Yeah, like earth was seen as solid and dry, water, obviously, fluid and wet.
Air was often thought of as gaseous, maybe hot, and fire, well, hot and
So
dry.
the thinking was everything you see, rocks, plants, animals, us, it's all just different recipes using these four ingredients.
Hmm. And it went beyond just physical makeup. These elements often had like symbolic meanings too, tied into the cosmos, maybe human nature.
It was a really powerful framework. It shaped Western thinking for, gosh, centuries. Philosophy, alchemy.
And crucially for our chat today, medicine.
Okay, yeah, let's get into that. Because this four elements idea connects directly to one of the long-lasting medical theories ever, the humoral theory.
Absolutely direct link. The four elements were mapped onto four bodily humors.
So earth was linked to black bile.
Black bile, yeah. Water to phlegm. Air was associated with blood. And fire with yellow bile.
Got it. So in this view, health wasn't really about your organs working right, not in the way we think now anyway. It was about balance.
Exactly. Having the right balance, the right proportions of these four humors flowing through you, that was health.
And illness.
Illness was simply an imbalance. Too much of one humor, maybe not enough of another. Diagnosis was about figuring out which humor was out of whack.
Based on symptoms, I guess.
Yeah.
Like if someone had a fever, maybe too much fire, too much yellow bile.
Something like that, yes.
Mhm.
And treatment was all about restoring that balance, that equilibrium.
Right. And the treatments. We touched on them. Things like bloodletting, if you had too much blood, supposedly.
Or purging, using things to make you vomit or have diarrhea to get rid of excess bile or phlegm.
Seems pretty rough.
Right.
But they also use diet and lifestyle changes. Right?
Oh, definitely. It wasn't all drastic interventions. Adjusting what you eat, your activity, your environment, all aimed at nudging those humors back into line.
And big names like Hippocrates and Galen were key in developing and promoting this system.
Hugely influential. And think about its staying power. This was the dominant medical way of thinking in the West for over 2,000 years.
It really is staggering. Which brings us back to that central question from the material.
Mm-hmm.
If it lasted that long, why didn't it just keep evolving? Why didn't it become the basis for modern medicine? Why the dead end?
Well, the sources point to some really critical issues. One of the main ones was a fundamental lack of empirical basis. It wasn't really testable in a modern sense.
Meaning you couldn't actually, like, isolate black bile or measure phlegm accurately. They were more like concepts.
Precisely. They were abstract ideas. And back then, they just didn't have the tools, no microscopes to see cells, no complex chemistry to analyze fluids properly.
Right.
So you couldn't really validate the theory at a tangible biological level. Diagnosis and treatment relied heavily on subjective interpretation. Is this hot, cold, wet, dry? It's hard to be objective.
Yeah, you can see how that would be tricky. And trying to explain every single disease, from a cold to cancer, with just 4 humors. It seems like a massive oversimplification looking back.
It definitely offered limited explanatory power. It couldn't really get at the specific underlying causes of diseases that we understand now, things like germs, bacteria, viruses, or genetic issues. How do you fit a virus into a humoral imbalance?
You can't, really.
Yeah.
So what was the final nail in the coffin? The material connects its decline pretty strongly to the scientific revolution, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That was the major turning point in the West. The rise of empirical science, this new emphasis on observation, experimentation, making hypotheses you could actually test.
That whole approach just clashed with the philosophical nature of the humoral theory.
Fundamentally. Plus, you had huge advancements in understanding the body itself, anatomy, physiology. Scientists started seeing how incredibly complex the human body actually is.
Way more complex than just 4 liquids sloshing around.
Exactly. The old humoral framework just couldn't contain all this new knowledge.
And then came the germ theory.
Right. Discovering microorganisms and proving they cause specific diseases that provided a much more accurate, testable explanation for so many illnesses. It essentially replaced the humoral theory as the main way to understand sickness in Western medicine.
Okay, so that's the story in the West.
Right.
A powerful, long-lasting theory based on elements, but ultimately superseded by empirical science because it wasn't verifiable or detailed enough.
That sums it up pretty well.
So now let's completely shift gears. Let's head east and look at the 5 elements theory in traditional Chinese medicine.
Okay. Wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, operating within the whole system of TCM.
And the crucial difference the material stresses right away is that, unlike the Western path, this theory did become part of a systematic, coherent medical framework that's still around.
It wasn't replaced in the same way. It was integrated and developed within its own tradition.
Which leads to the obvious follow-up. How did the 5 elements manage that? Why did it become so foundational and lasting in TCM?
The material suggests several interconnected reasons. A big one is TCM's core philosophy, this deep emphasis on interconnectedness and harmony.
You mean like the idea of the body mirroring nature?
Exactly, the concept of the unity of human and nature. Humans seen as a microcosm reflecting the macrocosm. This made applying the 5 elements which describe natural processes to the body's functions and its relationship with the environment feel very intuitive within that worldview.
So it's less about isolated parts, more about the whole system working together, interacting with the outside world.
Precisely. And that connects to the second point. These elements weren't static categories. The theory focuses hugely on dynamic relationships and cycles.
Ah, the generating and controlling cycles.
Yes. The generating cycle, Sheng cycle, describes how one element kind of nourishes or produces the next. Think wood feeding fire, fire creating earth, ash, and so on. And the controlling cycle, Qi cycle, shows how elements regulate or restrain each other, like water controls fire, metal chops wood. These cycles create this really quite sophisticated map for understanding how different parts of the body, seen through an elemental lens, influence and check each other.
So it's a system of checks and balances, dynamic interactions, not just a simple list.
Much more dynamic. And critically, this wasn't just armchair philosophy. It was developed and refined through centuries of clinical observation.
Ah, so practical application.
Huge amounts of it. TCM has this incredibly long, continuous history. Practitioners were constantly observing patients, seeing how these elemental patterns seemed to play out in symptoms, how treatments based on these ideas worked or didn't work. They refined the application of the theory over generations.
And the final piece the material highlights is how deeply integrated it is with other core TCM concepts.
Right, it doesn't stand alone. It's woven together with yin-yang theory, that idea of complementary opposites. With qi, the concept of vital energy or life force flowing through the body. With the meridian system, the pathways that qi is thought to travel along.
And the Zheng Fu organs.
And the Zheng Fu organ system, yes. Which isn't just about the physical organs, but their broader functions and energetic relationships, often described using 5 element correspondences.
So putting it all together, yin-yang, qi, meridians, Zhangfu, 5 elements, creates this cohesive, multi-layered system.
Exactly. The five elements act like a core organizing principle within that larger structure, helping to explain physiology, diagnose problems, and guide treatment.
Okay, now if we pull back and look at the big picture, the material really draws out these cultural and historical reasons for the divergence.
Yeah, the contrast in approach is stark when you look at it that way. TCM, coming out of Taoist and Confucian thought, really emphasizes that holistic view, everything connected, body and nature, balance, cycles.
Whereas Western thought, especially after the Renaissance and scientific revolution, increasingly went down a more reductionist path, breaking things down.
Right. Focusing on smaller and smaller parts, organs, tissues, cells, molecules, which of course led to incredible discoveries, but it's a different fundamental approach.
And the material suggests that Chinese culture's emphasis on harmony, balance with nature, cyclical patterns, that philosophical soil, which is very fertile ground for the 5 elements theory to take root and flourish within medicine.
It fit the broader cultural and philosophical landscape. It made sense within that context.
Whereas in the West, the intellectual landscape shifted. That demand for empirical proof, for testability, just couldn't be met by the old element-to-moral theory. So it got sidelined.
Yeah, science moved in a direction that required a different kind of evidence, a different way of validating knowledge. TCM continued to develop and validate knowledge within its own established framework, which included the five elements.
So it wasn't necessarily that one was right and one was wrong in their time, but that the criteria for what counted as valid medical knowledge diverged.
That seems to be a key insight. The scientific revolution created a paradigm shift in the West that fundamentally changed the rules of the game for medicine, leading away from element-based theories. TCM experienced more continuity, building on its existing foundations.
Okay, let's try to bring it all together then. The core contrast seems pretty clear now.
I think so. In the West, you have the four elements feeding into the humoral theory, hugely influential for millennia. But ultimately, its lack of empirical testability and its sort of oversimplified view meant it couldn't survive the rise of modern empirical science. It got replaced.
While in the East, the 5 elements theory, starting from similar ancient roots maybe, became deeply embedded in TCM. It thrived because it resonated with the cultural philosophy. It offered a dynamic way to view interconnectedness through its cycles. It was refined by loads of clinical practice, and it integrated really well with other key TCM ideas like yin-yang and qi.
It became a core part of a complex, internally consistent system that evolved along its own path.
It's a really powerful example, isn't it? How basic cultural beliefs, philosophy, and just how a society decides what counts as knowing something can shape the entire way people understand something as fundamental as health.
Absolutely. Two different starting points, or maybe similar starting points with elements, leading to vastly different yet internally logical medical traditions.
We've traced how the 4 elements in the West led to a theory that ran its course, replaced by science, while the 5 elements in TCM became systematized through integration, practice, and that cultural fit.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
It does. And maybe a final thought to leave everyone with, drawing from this. What does it say about us as humans that these ancient ideas about elements 4, 5, whatever, still echo? You see the metaphors sometimes in alternative health, just in the way we try to find patterns.
Does it point to some fundamental need we have? To find these organizing principles, these simple explanations for the incredibly complex world around us, and especially for our own bodies and health.
Something deep there to chew on, definitely, how we try to make sense of it all.